kind of smiling again
in a more robust way. So, so I'm going to be interacting with quite a bit, as well as like Vincent's ideas of artisanship, because through them, I think he's really not just constructing a new approach to political analysis, but a new approach to a new political theory, I think, political theory for the 20th and 21st century. That's a big claim to make. I'm willing to be challenged on that, but I have reasons for why I think this might be the case. All right, so in the quest for meaning in public choice, Elinor and Vincent write, Tocqueville was convinced that the exercise of self-governing capabilities would depend on the exercise of an artisanship grounded in an art and science of association. Maximizing utility without attention to the way that ideas shape deeds leads people to trample civilization underfoot. In this one tiny quote, there is a lot packed into this. The idea of maximizing utility without paying attention to ideas. Maximizing utility was a concern that public choice was grappling with. You know, and it was grappling with methodology in a way, this idea that do we just look at people in very closed systems, basically using statistics and math to evaluate their choices and boxing people in to, to predefined choices essentially. So Vincent and Elinor are grappling very strongly with public choice at the heart of this quote, but they're also bringing in, their emphasis on Tocquevillian association. And so the art and science is very important because they're pushing it back against this idea of science only, science, physical facts of the universe. And they're very much emphasizing art as part of that. So it's not just science, it's art, it's both and it's not even a binary. We can have them together in a way that's robust and richer for them both being part of the conversation. Oops. So these are a couple of puzzles that I've been grappling with in my paper and my thinking. And the first question was prompted by Vincent. And the question I ask is, what materials and processes are essential to the Ostroms' use of artisanship in their approach to political economy as manifested in the scholarly output in built environments? And I think this is what really prompted my thinking on this was the fact that Vincent reads political theory and political analysis. No, he gives us the opportunity to read his approach to political analysis in tandem with like the furniture that they made, because he gives us that example in his book, The Vulnerability of Democracies. And then there's a subtitle, it's a response to Tocqueville's challenge. So Vincent, and he presents his coffee table as an example of like this artifact and process of artisanship, but he does so in the context of talking about political theory, referring to various theorists, which I'll get to in a moment. I also have this other question. Why is Ostromian artisanship an important but marginal contribution to public choice? Oops, sorry. And what do we do with artisanship moving forward? So, and that's really the focus of my presentation today, and it will all be an important part of my work moving forward. So I conceive of the workshop artisanship as a fabric made up of various threads. And so the fabric of Ostromian artisanship, I think, is this alternative approach to political analysis. Vincent leans heavily, so a lot of this, the working out of artisanship, we see in Vincent's thinking. It's there in Elinor's work too, but it'll be like, a mention of like people are artisans of their lives or something like that as part of like her work, which is the practical applied side of things so often. But Vincent is always informing that. And so Vincent, I'm going to refer to Vincent here, assuming that Elinor is also bringing this into her work. Vincent, I think the first time Vincent grapples with this is in his speech, David Hume as a Political Analyst, which was given on the bicentennial of the American founding. So the deep roots to, interacting with political theorists and political practitioners of the 18th century America and the Scottish Enlightenment is not lost, should not be lost on us. I think this is intentional. And Vincent gives this talk at the conference on the Scottish contributions to social and political philosophy. He then develops this again in a much more well-known work, Artisanship and Artifact, in which was published in, I think, Public Administration. And Vincent is grappling with like, what does this look like in an organization, which we know was part of his political scholarship, was organizational, political public administration, but then working into public administration is like theories of organization. And then the meaning of democracy and the vulnerability of democracies is also where Vincent works out this idea of artisanship in great detail. And so that's in this last book, that's where Vincent juxtaposes his coffee table with his political analysis. I also see artisanship occurring at climactic moments in Vincent's writing, such as at the ends of chapters, or when he's wanting to highlight like really high level concepts that we might think of as occurring as part of the mental models with which the Ostroms saw the world and which they used to help them craft their various frameworks. So I also see this happening in Governing the Commons. There's only one moment at the end of the book, and it's like it's in the last few pages where Vincent talks about people being artisans of their own lives and shaping their own destinies. And of course, she's talking about this in the context of a commons, where she's refuting the idea that just because there doesn't appear to governance that we need. She's refuting the idea that we don't necessarily need a state to give us meaning or to give us the tools to be able to govern ourselves. And so that's where this idea of artisanship comes in. It's that no, like even somebody on the ground, close to their local situation, has the tools that they need to craft their political world, their governance systems. And she mentions this in Understanding Institutional Diversity, where she's thinking about artisanship in the idea of rules, that people make the rules by which they live. Some of the intellectual threads of Ostromian artisanship I see, or and Vincent tells us, is Hobbes' Leviathan, Hume's The Idea of a Perfect Commonwealth, Ludwig Lachmann, one of the German thinkers that Vincent was really intrigued with, Capital and its Structure, John R. Searle's Speech Acts. And if anybody's taken the IED class here, you know that like that our professors begin with John Searle, whether it's like Bill Bloomquist or Dan Cole. Searle is incredibly important to workshop thought. And finally, Herbert Simon's The Sciences of the Artificial. And I find this really interesting that Vincent is borrowing from Simon, because this work is about artificial intelligence from the 1960s. And so I realized that, early artificial intelligence grapples with what does it mean to be an intelligent being? And we see these threads like being woven into Vincent's work. Even though he never grapples with artificial intelligence proper, the concepts of how do we make ourselves intelligible and where does meaning come from? That's all over the place, especially in Vincent's approach and Elinor's approach to artisanship. So some of these ideas then, like the use of present means to achieve some apparent good, those are Hobbesian ideas. These are quotes that I've drawn from a block quote that's coming on the next slide. Vincent talks about like we use present means to achieve some future apparent good, but that this begins in our minds. So this is where human intelligibility and imagination becomes really important, and the process of working through something. It's that process of contestation, whether it's at the level that we're deciding on, constitutional rules, or whether we're deciding how to operationalize these rules. And then we have this idea of heterogeneity, which is difference, and complementarity. The idea that we don't just have one single idea or one single agenda that we're following to achieve our ends, but that we all bring different agendas to the table, and we have to work them out and figure out how to soften these pieces of the puzzle so that they fit together in a way that we can live with moving forward. And it has utilitarian and aesthetic purposes. In other words, utility is important, but that's just like, that's like the basic thing. That's not even like the end goal. And it's related to Searle's ideas on a brute fact and institutional fact. And so the idea of utility, of course, is the idea that like it's like the most basic, essential, like fulfills like a function. But oftentimes our conversations about utility forget the fact that we have form as well and not just function. And that even though we're accomplishing an end, like there's actually artistic choices that go into those decisions. And that's true whether you're building a constitution or a coffee table. I think that's what Vincent argues. So I see in their scholarly artifacts then, so I see Ostromian artifacts as having like a couple of different elements. One is their scholarly artifacts, which is this idea that, of their scholarship, their various writings. I also see it in the things that they built, and then the things that they collected too, because they were avid collectors of like artwork of the common people as they would travel and work with various people. So some of their scholarly artifacts I see are like federalism, governance, the IAD framework, even public choice, because they were involved. Like Vincent was a founding member, if you will, of Public Choice Society. Polycentricity is also an important part of the Ostrom scholarly artifacts, and then social ecological systems, which Elinor was working with towards the end of her career. And so these are artifacts. They're all important aspects of workshop output, but I believe that the process of artisanship is important. It helps us understand all of these things. And so by emphasizing artisanship, I'm not trying to say that like it is the most important thing that the Ostroms produce, because it's not. They produce a lot of critical ideas that shape our thinking today. But I think this idea of artisanship is a process that undergirds all of them. And so that's why I think that's why I'd like to see more emphasis in the scholarly world on the Ostrom's artisanship. Certainly, they believe it was important. I learned yesterday from the new curator for campus art that like Lynn really wanted people to know the workshop was influenced by their idea, like working with a craftsman, and I think that's well known. But it's because the Ostroms like wanted people to know that, so they emphasize that over and over through their career. So we should remember that moving forward. Oops, I'm sorry. I see that somebody's entered the waiting room. Welcome. Oops, hang on a sec. Okay, some of their institutional artifacts are the Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis, or the International Association for the Study of the Commons. And this is a former Ostrom fellow who took this picture of me because I was on my first visit here. I was just so excited to see the workshop and really see that, because there's an ecology here to the workshop, to being in the Tocqueville room, that helps you understand their ideas in a more real sense, I suppose. Some of their material artifacts, of course, I've already touched upon their furniture and their personal collections of native art. I use the word native intentionally. Some people might prefer indigenous peoples, but I grew up in Oklahoma, so native is like very, like, people are comfortable with that word. This is Vincent's coffee table. And this is the first piece that they made. I took this picture when it was at Harlow's house, but now it's like out in the sitting room outside the living room area outside the Ostrom room. So I hope you'll go take a look at it after we're finished. But here's what Vincent says about how he created this coffee table. And I want to read it in full because I think it's really important, because he describes this artisanship process. He says, building a coffee table with a cabinet maker involves the use of present means to achieve some future apparent good that began as a concept, fiction of the mind, and was worked through using two odd boards cut from black walnut trees. The cut edge of one, a piece of slab wood, became the surface of the table. A conky knot, I love that term, a conky knot had to be removed and filled with a wedged replacement. Another gnarled and splintered board was used to construct a set of legs. The curves used to shape the legs were later used to construct a lamp from blonde-colored gumwood, which is now located in a corner opposite the coffee table. Principles of heterogeneity and complementarity were used to put together pieces of furniture that serve both utilitarian, useful, I think that's Vincent's brackets, and aesthetic purposes in the ecology and economy of a household. The word ecology has been part of the Ostrom's thinking for a long time. And I think this idea of ecology and economy are really important. And so I'm going to address those as we move forward. So this is Vincent writing about their coffee table, but I have something else to show you. This is a video that Barbara Allen made and that she showed at Public Choice after Vincent and Lynn died. So it was an homage, part of an homage to them. Hold on a sec. It's always a challenge to figure out how to get to the other thing. Here we are. And what I find fascinating is to see Vincent and Elinor interacting as they're talking about their table.
To have reasonable jobs. I think
it was.
it was.
Can everybody
A pretty good idea
Can y'all
that
hear it
Vincent
okay?
had, because this
We-
was really Vincent's conception. We had worked together in workshops. I don't think I would have thought of it at the university, but given working with Paul Goodman and learning so much in a cabinet maker's workshop.
We had the great fortune of working with an excellent cabinet maker in his workshop. And we built the first table, which was a great success. And Paul was able to look at it and say, now, if we cut that here, there's things that we could see that you wouldn't otherwise. You learned about the thinking process of a real craftsman.
That was our first table that we ever made.
And we had a long argument about how to make the legs for the table. And we finally worked out that. And after we worked out that, as the basis of making the legs, we used the same design to make the lamp over in the corner.
The square versus circle argument. I don't know which of us wanted square legs and which wanted round, but we kept it back and forth, and so we have square with round inside.
And flat pieces of wood.
So it's a little like polycentricity that we are able to get some things on the outside and other things on the inside. So we're kind of pleased with those legs.
Being able to.
So that's where we're gonna wrap up that recording, but I just love that where Elinor says, it's kind of like polycentricity. And the way she moves her hands even it's this three-dimensional, like parabolas, it's like curved space. And that's how I think of polycentricity and about their models, because they're trying to overcome sort of our the limits that humans have in their thinking with ideas like polycentricity. And it's not just, well, anyways, I'll get to that later too, if we have time. But what I love is how they're thinking about this table. They're talking about how they worked out this and they worked out that, but it's this idea of contestation that's so important to their idea of political philosophy and political thinking, and how people work out their own problems. All right. And here's their coffee table in the workshop, and you can see like the curved legs. I was trying to get those and on the inside and on the outside, but you notice part of their compromise that they seem to have forgotten about is the back legs. They're curved on the outside and straight on the inside. So I think, but what I love the fact too was like, they don't remember like who wanted what. So as part of that process of consultation, there's this idea of like acceptance of other people's ideas and then moving forward with the solution, not holding grudges, not trying to claim credit, for this, oh, that was my idea. But no, we're moving forward together now in a way that's where we've like figured out like how we can both live with this. Oh, sorry. Something else I want to point out though about this coffee table is that you can see how Vincent and Elinor follow the grain of the wood. So I'm sorry, hold on a sec. You see, oh, Ian says, can you see the picture?
You have to
share.
I
Let's
cannot.
stop that.
Thank you. Thanks, Insa. Oops, hold on a sec. I'll share again. Sorry about that. Technology is great until you got to work with it, right? Here we go. Thank you. All right. So here's our coffee table. You can see that Vincent is following the natural line of the wood. So the ecology of the piece is really important, thinking about that natural elements and bringing that forward into this piece that's clearly been like that the Ostroms have clearly shaped with human hands and human resources. So that natural element of the live wood is important. You also see the live edge in their dining room table, and now it's in the Ostrom room here on campus at the Hamilton Luger School of Global Studies. But you can see that in contrast to the coffee table, this table has like some sort of polyurethane over the top of it or veneer. And that's because it's fitting the function and the function of the table. This is the utility aspect of it. But it's because obviously on a dining room table, you're going to want to wipe it off and, clean up spills and protect the wood from those sorts of things. A coffee table is less so. And so if you look at the coffee table, actually, there's like a couple of, rings from water there because it wasn't varnished. So in a sense, then this beautiful glossy layer, it's like we see it as an aesthetic element, but I think it also has this aspect of utility as well, the unity of form and function. And finally, like in my paper right now, I have like these tables that we're sitting at here in the Tocqueville room and that you see in the picture, like they're designed so differently from the pieces of furniture in the Ostrom's home, for the Ostrom's home. The Ostroms also built these tables, but they're like much more, and they're beautiful as well. And we have all of these like coasters to protect them, but it's definitely the function and is much more, the form is much more basic in some ways, because of like because it fits in the ecology where ideas are worked out and discussed. So what you do at these tables is going to be a little different than what you would do at a dining room table or a coffee table. And they fit the ecology of the workshop. And that's something important to note too. Like this space has its own ecology. And that the things that we make for it, whether it's the rules that govern the workshop or the rules that, or the things that we make for the workshop, they're different from the rules that we would use in a home, for instance. And this idea of rules really sort of hit home to me. I think when I did a podcast interview with Esther Blanco, she was talking about how there were rules that governed like how people interacted in the workshop, even who cleaned what. And she said Elinor had a place on that, task list as well. And she would like rotate just like everybody else would. Now we're blessed to have janitors who do a lot of the cleaning for us, but rules and things, material things often go hand in hand because we are people who live in a physical world and yet do very immaterial things like make constitutions, imagine different futures. These are some of the things that they collected. These are in the Ostrom room, and the outgoing of the former curator of campus art told me, she said, it's very eclectic, but it's the artwork of the common people. And so it has this sort of a similar color scheme. So what I saw in examples of the Ostrom's tables and the example of the things they collected is that there's like important things I think that we can look for as we look at people's ideas, at the way they make things, which is patterns. Often people are pretty consistent. We make things and our personalities come through that. So we can often find patterns. And this is true if you're looking at the works of a composer like Diego and I do, or like you're looking at the Ostrom's furniture, for instance, which has all of this live wood. And this is true for the furniture that like was connected to their home and that couldn't be taken out. Eclecticism is another aspect of their thinking. Aureli and Craiutu wrote a book chapter describing that, like the eclecticism of their scholarly thought. And we see that, like, Vincent borrowing from David, like combining David Hume with John or Searle. That's pretty eclectic, in spanning the centuries. So in my paper, a really important part of my paper is kind of the framework that I'm working with. And I finally found the source that was published in 2021. And so I've only had my hands on this book for a couple of weeks, but it talks about art as a complex system. I'll talk about that before moving on to my slide. Art as a complex system includes the idea that an artwork can communicate information. And I think that's absolutely true. I think that's probably how Vincent thought about it, even if he didn't get to talk about it in the sense of an artwork, like communicating information, with the theory as it's developed today. But that's how we talked about it. That's just the word that we would use to talk about, that's sort of the label we would talk about. We would use to describe Vincent's ideas in retrospect. I suspect if he were still alive, he would have really enjoyed some of the developments along this line of scholarship, especially the recent ones. So one of the things that my advisors challenged me to look at is to think about the coffee table as an example of how we might write a research paper, that the edges aren't neat and tidy and straight. And I'm speaking of Vincent's coffee table, not these tables, but it has the curved edge that follows the natural grain, because of the idea that research, if we're being as robust as the Ostroms were, and we're mixing methods and we're trying to describe reality, we're not going to have neat and tidy boxes. And so the way he thought about the research paper, I realized was the operational level. When I thought about this project, I was already thinking of like the constitutional level of things, you know, where Vincent's writing at the constitutional level. We talked about ecology. Well, the framework that deals with ecology is the social ecological system. And part of the social ecological system is to try and come to terms with this long line of thinking that we see in Vincent's. You know, in Vincent's, David Hume is a political analyst, where he's citing Searle's brute facts and institutional facts. They're grappling with the idea that a brute fact, which is like a physical fact of the world, like the boiling point is 212 degrees. You know, scientists had started arguing that that's what our scholarship should be. I mean, that's what positivism is. And Vincent has been arguing, and Elinor too, that like, no, positivism is incomplete. It gives us such a narrow view of the world. So this is something I need to add to my paper. I've made notes in my paper that it's coming, but also I really want to add like some of Vincent's work with the Alaska Constitution, not just because it's cool, you know, but it is cool, but because he talks about how words are the tools with which we make things. And so he actually started like this glossary of words and what he thought they meant. I think it has like 3 words on it, but the fact that he was thinking in those terms, I think is instructional, because he's thinking about like, okay, we're actually making this constitution. And if our words are our tools, we need to know like their form and their function. So this idea of our work as an informational system is another way of thinking about political theory, I think, as a complex order. And so when you have complex orders, then they're not really static orders. They're it's this idea that thanks, Nathan. I just want to make sure I'm not missing like anything serious. So sorry to interrupt. Complex orders was an incredibly important part of the Ostrom's thinking. A polycentric system, for instance, is an example of that, where it's not this idea that you have one power center, but that power is dispersed among multiple power centers. And this way, I think complex orders, frankly, undergirds thinking on the commons as well. And that's one of the things that Elinor, you know, the idea that people who don't have states governing themselves, Elinor intentionally was intentionally setting out to discover, you know, are these people, are their lives really as simple as they've been portrayed to be? And she found that no, they're not. People understand their preferences, they understand their needs. They're complicated because complex orders, I think, arise from the fact that, you know, you have multiple people trying to do life together, and we have to resolve our different preferences and our different visions of what our life looks like. So art and systems theory then plays into this really well, because art includes fact and art form and function. It includes brute fact, like say, you know, the color of the paint as blue, or the material that we work with as oil and canvas, or the furniture as wood and, you know, and a woodworker's saws. But it also includes the aesthetic component as well. It includes the institutional fact. In other words, it's both art and science, art and technique, to use an Aristotelian idea. That also, I think, is present in Vincent's work, even though he doesn't explain it as such, because he was also really interested in Ibn Khaldun's ideas. And so I started reading Khaldun last week, his work on culture, which is what Vincent really taps into. I'm like, golly, there's this idea of art and technique that Khaldun is grappling with in the passages that Vincent had pointed his readers to. So I'm nearing the end of my talk, and it's about the time to do that. So as far as engagement with public choice, Vincent engaged with Buchanan's natural man, personal agency. This idea that we don't need people from the outside to tell us how to live our lives, but that we actually know our preferences. We don't need people to tell us what we want, because we already know that. And we can also imagine a different future for ourselves. That's a point that Jim Buchanan makes in Natural and Artifactual Man. And Buchanan is responding to Vincent's, David Hume as political analyst. So this idea, I think, Paul Alajica gives Buchanan credit for dealing with the idea of artifactuality and artisanship. I think that's magnanimous. I respect Paul so much. And this is one point where I'm gonna say, I think it was Vincent. Because his work comes out 3 years earlier. But who knows, maybe they had personal conversations that we don't know about. All right, decision-making processes. An artisan has to decide, to replace a conky knot with a different piece of wood. If you're working in an organization, if you're dealing with public administration, officials have to make decision processes. Vincent and Buchanan both were pushing against the idea of making decisions as being value-free endeavors, which was a big argument that a lot of public administration schools were making. And Vincent and Buchanan are like, no. Just because someone holds up a government position doesn't mean that they're not self-motivated. And so it's this union of fact and value, the idea that we have both brute and institutional fact, and then bringing art into scholarship, the art and science of things. And so in Vincent's idea, you see this trope, or Vincent's writing, you see this trope, art and science of association. I forget what else he uses it in tandem with, or you'll see the art of association. And what Vincent is doing by saying art and science is he's modifying Tocqueville's ideas and bringing them into the 20th century. And with that, I'll say thank you. But before we open for questions, I do want to thank the Ostrom workshop for this year, for the Ostrom Fellowship this year. It's always a rich experience to be able to take the ID class and be involved with the many different programs offered here. And the Mercatus Center at George Mason University has also been really critical to introducing me to the Bloomington ideas, actually. I applied for the fellowship as a student in the Jacobs School of Music. And I was like, what's this Bloomington school? I've never heard of it. And that's just because of university siloing. That's a normal thing. But thank you to Mercatus Center for also exposing me to Bloomington School ideas, because I'm here as a result of this wonderful opportunity. So thank you. I'd like to open the floor.
Thank you, Jaime. That was amazing. I'm having some trouble finding parking. I'm really close, guys, but I'm wondering, I saw Bernie. I think you're in the room. Would you mind maybe just trying to take some moderating here, some Q&A?
Sure, be glad to add it to my paycheck. Okay,
You got it, sir.
So I'm just going to point to people as they raise their hands, and then we'll eventually go on the screen too. So we'll let you do first because you're in the room.
Okay, thanks. I have a quick question. Actually, doesn't have anything to do with the paper. It has to do with the tables. Okay.
Okay.
Because I built houses, a couple of houses. And so in 2006, 2007, I'm trying to figure out exactly when I first saw that raw edge in commercial tables. And I was like totally attracted to it. It was like 10 grand a table at the real high end stuff. And it was the very, very first time, and I'm very familiar with like what all the furniture is out there in this period. And I'm like, when did they do that? Because somebody saw it and picked it up, because commercially right now you can buy that raw edge table.
It is. It's a fad. Yes, totally a fad now.
Like they must have started it.
Right? Okay, so here's something else that I learned. This is why I think the ecology of their material things matters, because a lot of their techniques came from working in Paul Goodman's workshop. And if you have things to add, Bernie, I love listening to what people know. Yeah, so that's where a lot of the ideas came from too, was working with Paul Goodman. But I learned also from the former curator of campus art that Bloomington had a furniture factory here.
Right.
And so Showers, yes.
Huge.
Bloomington had multiple furniture.
Huge, yeah.
It was a huge industry in the city in the early 1900s.
Right.
Yeah.
And we retain some of that through the arts and there's a lively arts and crafts culture here in Southern Indiana as well.
Largest furniture manufacturing in the country here at Showers for that era.
Yeah.
40s.
I mean, my guess, this is just me guessing. So I would love to, to hear from those of you who know that. So the opportunity even to learn how to make furniture existed because of the ecology, like around furniture making and valuing finely crafted furniture. That's
well, as a quick side note on that, the furniture industry has been always centered in the Midwest in Indiana. because we had the finest hardwoods.
Mhm.
And if you talk to many of the hardwood companies, they would harvest wood in other states and ship it here because we had the industry. And they would actually take the truck to ship the logs here back empty to Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, because the industry was based here, really high quality industry. The industry here was obviously kind of had several different modes. So one was it was very strongly office furniture, high-end office furniture for the Chicago furniture market. But it was also very much personal furniture as well. Very interesting and a lot of history. There's some really good books on the history of the industry. So we're going to go next to Brian. You'll be next, Brian. Speak up.
Actually, I think Tanya was ahead of me.
Well, I've got Tanya next. Okay, we'll do it.
Okay.
I'm just doing the order I could do. Go ahead, Brian.
Good. Okay, so this is a great topic, lots of great stuff. And my main comment, I mean, what you have, the good, solid paper, fascinating for people in the Bloomington School or interested in the workshop. But I would strongly encourage in your dissertation and maybe other paper or papers also to develop much more, aim higher, the big guns kind of stuff, which is in, your current draft paper about, the issues you're dealing with and what the Ostroms offer for addressing the limitations and going beyond the limitations of positivism, of the concept of spontaneous order and its difficulty in dealing with deliberation and construction, and the whole utility maximization. And I would add kind of transaction cost efficiency as if it's, the most important, analytic heuristic, as opposed to what you're emphasizing, the artisanship. So this is, mainly, a comment that I think there's a whole lot more in here in terms of what you're taking on, what the Ostroms offered, and what they give, you and lots of us to build on to deal with a lot of these big issues. And that can be incorporated both in the motivation and then ideas that you may develop further in other places. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. I suspect that eventually this will become a book. There's so much that I didn't say, so much to add. I feel like that oil painter, who adds layers of paint on top of what they're doing. Yeah, thank you.
Tanya, you're next, and then Jaime will be after that.
Hi, Jaime. This is super interesting to see how your project's developed since last semester when we took the institutional analysis and development class together. So this is really fun to see and get to hear you talk and read the paper. From what I had time to skim through, at least my water was shut off this morning, so it's been kind of hectic. But yeah, I really like this analogy of, especially talking about democracy and, polycentric solutions to public choice problems, thinking about, these things that you talked about, like heterogeneity and complementarity and how things fit together to create something very unique. So I think that whole discussion is super interesting. And I always love kind of pushback and emphasis when I see it, like you discussed at the end of, this whole emphasis on human agency and personal agency. And I always think that that's really important. And that's something that I think a lot of political scientists tend to, I guess, kind of push to the side sometimes. But at the same time, with thinking about, personal agency, I think moving forward, and this is probably the typical pushback that I think comes forward in a lot of the frameworks that were proposed by the Ostroms, but maybe more about the kind of, resource limitations, right? Because I guess I was thinking if we're going to think about a sort of polycentric system, a table being like that, then we also have to think about what's limited in the first place in terms of resources that produce that unique outcome, in the first place, what are we starting with? like what kind of limitations are already in place. And with thinking about like, and like, I totally think it's super interesting and totally agree that it has, you know, thinking about this way really speaks to, you know, personal agency and everything. And I do like agree that for a lot of times people do know their preferences, but people are also constrained by their ability to express their preferences. So I'm thinking of Timur Karan wrote a piece back in like 1991 about people's responses to repressive governments in terms of social movements and protests. And a lot of people succumb to preference falsification, like they know what they really think and feel personally, but they're constrained by their environment, and people have different barriers to what they're able to like overcome. So I guess moving forward, I would just encourage you to like maybe address some of those things a little bit more explicitly. But again, this is probably the political scientist in me talking, and I know we come from very different perspectives and disciplines, but yeah, that was my main comment. Overall, like I said, super interesting. Sorry, dog barking. I'm gonna go ahead and mute now.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Tanya, for your feedback on that. And I do need to read Timur Karan. Like Paul Alajika told me to read him, and I still have that's still on my reading list. But so thank you for reminding me of that. And you're absolutely right. Like we don't live in a perfect world, and barriers and limitations are things that the Ostroms certainly acknowledged. And so you're right. Because of that, that should be in my paper more. Thank you so much.
Jaime, you're next.
Hi, Jaime. It's good to see you. It's nice
to see you
to
too,
see. It's nice to hear you give a talk. And now I know you're the triple threat: organ, writing, and you can give an engaging lecture. So I really like that you're diving deeper into trying to figure out what this notion of artisanship actually means. And the only, the main thing I wanted to offer is just an idea of another literature that you could connect into, because the whole time you were speaking, I kept thinking about what is it that the Ostrom, like what is the material that we are working with when we're crafting human institutions, and what are the limitations on our ability to create given kind of the nature of whatever that material is. So it made me think of the debate within institutional economics over whether institutions determine our choices, and if they don't quite determine them, do they shape them, and how do they shape them? So in particular, I wanted to recommend to you the work of Paul Lewis on critical realism and social ontology. And one of the reasons is that he has a paper which I can send to you where he draws out this really nice metaphor about how when we're crafting institutions, we don't, we're not working with material that can be transformed into anything at all. So he gives this analogy of the sculptor who has this block of marble. So they're bringing this artistic vision to it, but there are going to be inherent limitations within that, piece of rock. There are going to be things that it's easier to transform that piece of rock into than others. And so just this idea of what can the artisan accomplish with this activity? What is their challenge? I don't know. So I don't want to, I'm not trying to make your project my project, but I just would be really interested to hear anything that you have to say on that, or whether that's a direction that you might be interested in going in the future.
Potentially, yes. I think right now I have a lot on my plate, just grappling with what artisanship means in the workshops, or in the Ostroms idea and in the workshop sense. But I think if this is not a part of the current project, it definitely needs to be a separate paper at least. I think you bring up a really good point that Vincent also brings up in his Artisanship and Artifact article, which is the idea that people as part of human-made institutions are both the artisans. They get to participate in some of the rules that they make, versus being the artifacts that the rules and the institutions also shape. But your comment also touches on this idea of materiality and limitations, like Tanya's. So I'm definitely I'm sensing the need to interact with this in my project more than I do. I'd love to see Paul's work, because I love Paul Lewis's work a lot. I don't know that piece.
I'll send it along. It's in the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, but it's, you know, one of these papers with a super long title that's I have no chance of remembering it right now.
I want to give a shout out to Jamie's talk. It's coming up in not this Monday, but I think the Monday after. She's going to be presenting here for the Ostrom Colloquium too. So y'all come, it's going to be really cool.
All right, so the next two are Nathaniel and then Wes. Nathaniel, you're up.
Thank you. I'm glad to be paying attention today and to see some of your other work, Jamie, besides what we're working on together. I wanted to draw attention to the ideas about talk and how talk matters, and to extend it to what I call repertoire, and then think about repertoire in craftsmanship. So we talked about, you know, the sides of the table and how that became acceptable at some point after, you know, before which it was considered, you know, oh, you don't have a finished table. We riff on the repertoire, we change it, but the repertoire, the things that are acceptable are sort of the tacit social constitution within which we learn how to talk with one another, and then they form the rules for how we talk when we are forming the greater social constitution. And if we had an egalitarian kind of conversation at the stage of talking about what constitution we want to have, we might be more likely to get an egalitarian constitution coming out of it. But if there's a demagogue running the conversation, then we're more likely to end up with a hierarchical form of constitution. And all that ties back to Adam Smith's sympathies of exchange and how we think about that.
Okay, sorry, I'm just making notes so I don't forget. Who's running? Yeah, that's an interesting question. That who's running the conversation can determine who has the say. I don't have much to say on that right now. I'm just gonna say I'll investigate that. You know, think more, and then I'd love to have a conversation with you about that again later. But actually, my initial thought was this idea of tacit social constitution. It makes me think of like what the Ostroms described as their mental models. Like they would say that people come into these conversations, you know, culturally even with certain assumptions that they don't have to talk about because it's a shared mental model. So yeah, okay, I'll think more about that in the Smithian sense. Thank you, Nathan.
Next up is Wes and then Diego.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed the talk. My comment's kind of on the structure of the paper and how to go about putting these pieces together. Because I think you do a good job of like digging into these various aspects about artisanship. And like clearly artisanship is very complex and clearly quite fuzzy at times, right? And so it's a task to really parse it out. However, I think that leaves you with a bunch of kind of different parts of your paper. And I think you can think about how best to organize them to get the reader's attention. So for example, your first like 5 or 6 pages or so are really in depth into the nitty gritty of what is artisanship, very term heavy. I think that's all appropriate, but I would love to see those tables earlier. Like I think those tables are your hook. So if this becomes a book, I think like post introduction or maybe first chapter is you talking about these tables. And then that is your segue into these terms, which are a lot, take more like intellectual engagement to really grasp and understand well. And then you can dig into like individual analogies of how the shape of this table helps communicate this research agenda. I think that's the approach I would recommend.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your feedback. That's, yeah.
Anything to respond to that, or just you're going to?
Great idea. Love it.
Okay. There you go.
Well, first of all, congratulations. Seeing that how you make the connections between something very artistic to something that we consider very political, very economic, it's amazing. And one of the, if I understood correctly, your paper, one of your goals is try to incorporate the artistic thinking into the way that the political and economic sciences are built. And one of my questions here is, you are suggesting that because why? Because what the art can bring to the political and economic science development from my perspective, is the human thing. Like we are not, when we are analyzing something, we cannot only put boxes totally clean and saying like the humans are not really interacting with that, because if we analyze the problem, we are actually interacting with the problem. And I don't know your approaches for that one. This is the first question. And the second is, you were saying that sometimes the artists have like the freedom because of the artistic license to think ahead without trying to explain so much. For instance, where you're saying about scientific, it's, I'm sorry, like in the 60s, people thinking about intelligence, artificial intelligence, but by this moment was not even a realistic technological possibility, but the artists could think about that. Therefore, in your approach or your thinking, which kind of artistic licenses are good in order to help build the political and economic science of the future? I don't know.
Like how much, like, so I want to see if I can reframe your question. The idea is like, how much freedom should we allow ourselves in our artistic thinking? Imagining the future.
Yeah, yeah, because for example, thinking about the coffee table, I'm sure because we analyze a lot of work process and how the composer made the piece or how an artist draws or whatever. There are so many not real steps or totally defined steps to make something. Sometimes it's very organic, very human, and you do something and then you realize, oh, that is working. But then you have the time to analyze why it's working. This is the kind of artistic licenses that I'm not sure if it's your intent.
It's something I want to bring into my work. So what the phrase I would use to describe what Diego's talking about is like this idea of artistic choice, that sometimes you don't know what the object's going to look like at the end of the process. You don't, but you start with limitations. And you might start with the material, like the types of boards that the Ostroms worked with. And that's a big part of your limitation, or the types of tools you have in your shop. But as you go through the process, you know, you make one decision and then you do it, and then you step back and say, okay, do I like the outcome so far? If I think I want this outcome, how do I need to redirect? So this idea of artisanship that I don't think Vincent explains very well. I think it is that human component of we make choices as we go along. And they're not predefined choices. I think I know because they're talking about artisanship contra to utility maximization, that's what they're pushing against, this idea of predetermined choice. But yeah, I want to bring this, really emphasize the element of artistic choice. Vincent talks about choice, but it's not in his artisanship. It's more in his thinking on public administrations and organizational theory, because that's where the conversation about choice seems to really be happening. And in Vincent's work, that's where he sees this overlap between public choice, which he had been invited to participate in, and public administration, which was his academic home as a division of political science. So choice then becomes this overlap. That was something I wanted to add to my PowerPoint, a Venn diagram showing the overlap between public choice, administration, and artisanship. Because at the intersection of those three, that's where you have choice. Goodness, a picture really is worth like so much more than any of the words we could say sometimes.
So
Are we done?
I've got one up here. I'm going to do Dan Cole. Dan Cole first.
Okay, I'll just be really quick. One sort of cautionary note as you proceed with this, Jaime, we can't forget that a lot of artistry and artisanship is not about society. It is about individual creativity, right? Whereas when Vincent's writing about artisanship in a political context, it's about solving social problems, about self-governance within a group. But less, we shouldn't assume that he's using artisanship in the same sense when he's talking about individual craftsmen expressing themselves, their ideas through creations, whether it's a piece of furniture or it's a sculpture or a painting. You know, Vincent was certainly not a socialist realist, in which every work of art was required to contribute something to the social order or reflect the social order in some way. So we need this distinction still between social choice or public choice and private choice, a private expression of the individual. I'll stop there.
I have nothing more to say, Dan. You've always get me thinking now. I wish you were here so I could keep asking you questions.
I got two last short ones, I hope, you and then Diego again, okay?
I have two short things. The word artisanship versus art, I think, is something to really look at. Like, what he's talking about is the process, and that we take artisanship into our process, not like we're all creating art. That actually is, I think, a pretty big distinction. And then the other thing that that I will just offer is Shoshana Zuboff says, who decides and who decides who decides. It's a very succinct way of putting that other problem that you have on the table.
Diego, short.
Yeah, was very connected to that. What is art and what is artisanship? It's also something that even we as an artist, we don't know actually. And the other thing is, I disagree a little bit with Dan that artist is just a self one. If we analyze the artists that actually have passed so many years, they are always working to our social message. Obviously, they use their own style, they use whatever, but it's not about them. And that's why the real artic or artifact thing is not about a person, it's about a community thing, as the way that I see. But yeah, we should review more.
We'll turn it over to Jaime to close the session out. What would you like to close it with?
That Dan and Diego now have proposed a really interesting problem to solve that's critical to this conversation. But just, I think, thinking about artisanship as a process in these terms provides us with a framework for looking at musical works. For instance, a lot of what is going on in this project, I see happening in my work on like the Eurovision Song Contest as I study for my exams, where genre, the thing that's made, becomes this way that we can see political expression. So yeah, so just thank you all so much for your feedback.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bernie.